Well, if you've been with us for the last few weeks, you know we've been in the book of Daniel, and we've made it into the 3rd chapter, so that's where we're at tonight again. We made it down last week around verse 13 or 14, somewhere in that area, before we ran out of time, and so we're going to pick up tonight. I'm just simply going to pick up, I think, in verse 19 and just read on through the end of this in just a moment. But I do want us to kind of have just a little recap of kind of where we're at. So if you have not been with us, maybe you can kind of catch up in a hurry. A few weeks ago when we started in the book of Daniel, one of the earlier things that I told you about the book of Daniel was, you see the purpose in Daniel's life. You see the purpose in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's life. And so it is a book that's about purpose, but it's also a book that contains a lot of prophecy, and you see that in the book of Daniel. But you also understand that not only is it prophecy and purpose, there's a great deal with prayer, but the overarching theme throughout the book that you see over and over again is the sovereignty of Christ throughout the book. And tonight is no exception. You begin to see in chapter 3 about the sovereignty of God, and it's played out in the lives of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as you see them put to the test tonight. And last week we opened up by just basically with an Adrian Rogers quote that Steve had shared with me. It said, "Is your faith in God such that you will trust God regardless of life circumstances?" And the quote was, "Are the things that you're living for worth Jesus dying for?" In other words, the things that we do day in, day out, is it reflective of Christ living in us? What we're living for, is it really worth Christ dying for? And we went through a lot of different texts last week, and one of the verses that I used came out of Isaiah 43 and verse 10 through 12. And it says, "You are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. I, even I, am the Lord, and besides me there is no Savior. I have declared and saved, and I have showed when there were no strange gods among you. Therefore you are my witnesses, saith the Lord, that I am God." That's Isaiah 43 and 12. So when we talked last week, we talked about the sovereignty of God. And so when you open up into chapter 3, and I won't go back and rehash all of that, but you've got Nebuchadnezzar building this massive golden statue that was roughly 9 foot wide, 90 feet high. And the command that the king gave was that everybody was going to bow down and worship this golden image that he had set or had built for the people. And we don't know that the image was of Nebuchadnezzar, but there's a good probability that it probably was. And we looked previously in chapter 2 about the different kingdoms that will come, and Daniel had told Nebuchadnezzar that that you're the head of gold on this statue. So that was the first kingdom, and Daniel told him that God had given him the kingdom which he was over, which he now saw was superior and had great peace, and all the things that Daniel told him. And then immediately into chapter 3 is where the statue is built, and the command is given for the people to worship. And so that kind of gives you a recap of where we were at last week when we finished. And these 3 young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they fell under this command that was given. And in the moment that their faith was tested, they refused to bow down. And we know they refused to bow down because they understood that they worshiped the one and only true God. And to bow down to another image would be, worshiping an idol, would be defiling their belief in God. God says that we're to have, no other gods before Him. And these three young men knew that they were not going to do anything that was going to be contrary to God or His Word or His law. And so therefore, they would not bow down. And so that sets up the confrontation that we see taking place. And I'm going to go back tonight just very quickly, but in verses 14 and 15, Nebuchadnezzar gets word that these young men refused to bow down. So Nebuchadnezzar, it says, he spake unto them and said, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods? And notice that's little g with an S. So there was multiple gods that this Babylonian system worshipped. It was a pagan culture. It was given to idolatry. And so but the God that he's talking about now is this massive statue that has been built and erected and that he wants all the people to bow down to. But he says, Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up. He said, Now if you be ready, that at what time you hear the word of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the psaltery, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all the kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made. He says, well. In other words, if you'll be willing to compromise your faith and fall down when you hear the music, then everything is okay. I'm basically going to give you a second chance. I don't care if you continue to worship your God, but I want you to know when you hear the sound, I expect you to fall down and worship the God that I have built. But these young men refused. And then it says at the rest of that verse, the image which I have made well, but if you worship not, you shall be cast into the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? So you know from that one verse that Nebuchadnezzar does not know this God that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are worshiping. But if you look a little deeper in that verse, what you realize is that Nebuchadnezzar realizes that this God that they worship is really inferior to him. Because he wants to know who is the God that is able to deliver you out of my hand. Nebuchadnezzar was a man that was full of pride. He was full of arrogance. He was full of himself. Because there was nobody left that he hadn't conquered. He had even brought, these Jewish captives there to Babylon to be raised in the culture and to serve him. And to think that they would not bow down and worship the image that he had made, was something that was going to be totally unacceptable in his sight. It was insubordination. He wanted them to recognize him as being the most powerful man upon the earth. The charges that were brought against these men, you can look back over in verse 12, as they were accused, it says, They have not regarded thee, they serve not thy gods, and they worship not the golden image which thou hast set up. That was the three charges against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they wanted them, Nebuchadnezzar wanted these three young men to compromise their faith. And they were unwilling, and he was infuriated. And that's where we're going to pick up tonight. If you'll just look, we'll start in verse 16 there. And it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So they made it a point to be very plain that, we don't know what the outcome of this is going to be. But I can tell you this, I know that my God that I serve is able to deliver me at any moment, out of any trial, out of anything that I face, because he is the only true God. But if he chooses not to deliver me, I'm well with that too. Because I understand that even in the end, I'm going to be okay because he's the most powerful God in the universe. Because he is God alone. And it says in verse 19 that Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury. Well, you can only imagine. Here's the most powerful man on the planet. He's subdued nations. He's overthrown kingdoms. He has destroyed cultures. He's brought into captivity all of these young men that are now living under his authority and rulership. And they refuse to bow down as they're commanded. And so it says that the form of his visage or his appearance was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, their hats, and all their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake and said to his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth in the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose body the fire had no power, neither was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, language, which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So that's the reading out of the remainder of chapter 3. Now there's a lot of things that you could say about this chapter as a whole. There's a lot of lessons that we can learn from it. Certainly, for all of us living in today's culture, our faith, we're called by God to live for Him each day. We're to live holy because he's holy. You know, we're to stand out in the midst of our culture that has gone astray, just like these three young men were standing out now, literally, because they had been spotted that they were refusing to bow down to this image that the king had built. So they were unwilling to compromise their faith. And these young men did so knowing that to stand out and to stand up meant that they may have to pay the ultimate sacrifice, you know, with their own lives, knowing that the king made it very clear what would happen, that, you know, if you refuse to bow down, then you're going into the fiery furnace. And when they refused, he was infuriated, and he commanded the furnace to be heated up even more. Now, when you read this story and you read chapter 3, you have to kind of step back and just take a look at some of the things that are going on. One, when you look at this story, you may read over it and say, well, that's a really good, entertaining story, but you know, that's really not practical, because, you know, that's just some story that's in this book to kind of entertain me and say that may happen. But when you understand the backdrop to the story, the leading up of the king's dream, you understand Daniel's interpretation of the dream, and then you see the things that are unfolding. You know, what God is trying to show us in the midst of all this is that he is sovereign over everything, every detail. That things don't happen randomly or by chance. God is orchestrating everything, and what he wanted to know and what he wanted to reveal to those that were witness to the things that were taking place, that he alone is God and that he's worthy to be praised. And for Nebuchadnezzar, he was a king over a nation that God had allowed to conquer the other nations of the world. And he was this head of gold on this statue that Daniel had interpreted to him. And now, Daniel is not mentioned in this story, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are mentioned. And they're shown as being men in everyday life in a culture that's gone astray, and they're called to either stand for God or compromise their faith. Now, we're going to come back to Daniel, you know, because the obvious question, well, where's Daniel? And we really don't know. I mean, we don't know where Daniel's at, but I'll tie it in at the very end. But this chapter deals with these three men. And it's dealing with the fact that they were in that culture and they were caused to compromise their faith, and they refused. And so in the midst of this story, we find that the king is infuriated, because to think that there's another God that could overrule my word and my command, who do you think you are, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? There are no greater gods than me. And if I give a command to bow down, then you need to immediately be subject to bowing down. But Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego refused. And so the king, therefore, was irate. And he commanded them, as you saw, to be bound and thrown into the fire. And in the midst of this fire, we're introduced by Nebuchadnezzar to the one like the Son of God. And so even in the midst of what they were going through, God was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know, we think today when we go through trials in life that God is not with us. But we're not, you know, to be resentful of the trials. Well, we have to understand that God uses trials many times in life to reveal our weaknesses, or our shallowness of faith, or our need to grow or improve in certain areas of our life. You know, how far will we trust Him? You know, you think about maybe an analogy about somebody that goes to a gym. That's somebody like me that, you know, stays out of a gym as much as possible, and I don't lift no weights, and I hated that stuff even when I did it. You know, but you know, that person that goes into a gym and they don't know anything about lifting weights, and, you know, they're kind of shy and reserved, and, you know, the only way they'll really find out what strength they have is to put it to the test. And if you never go through a trial, if you never go through a test in life, you're really not going to find out how deep your faith is and how much you really trust God. If life was perfect all the time, we wouldn't know. But as we go through the trials in life, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did in this moment, they found out what they really believed. And until the trial really hits, you can't really know what you believe. And these men, they were there and they didn't waver. And in the midst of that trial, it says in verse 25, Nebuchadnezzar said, "Lo, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the fourth is like the Son of God." You know, we think that, this may be, the first time that God is with them. But God was with them when they stood up before the king. God was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were brought out of captivity to Babylon as teenagers. The Bible tells us that He never leaves us nor forsakes us. Hebrews 13:5. He's always with us. Regardless of what's going on in our life, God is always there. He always gives us strength to endure whatever we face. And a lot of people, when the tests come, they quit believing in the presence of God. They quit believing in the faithfulness of God. But God is always with us. And I can hear what many of you are thinking right now. I've been through things and God wasn't with me. I prayed that my marriage would stay together and it fell apart. I prayed that my son or my daughter would have survived, but they died. And those are hard things to deal with. I understand that. But God doesn't leave us in those moments. God is always there in the midst of all that. The Bible's very clear that for the believer that we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He doesn't say anything for the believer that we stop there, that life ends at the grave. He just says we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego found themselves in the midst of the fire, but yet they were no longer bound. They were loose. They were walking in the fire. And in the midst of their faithfulness, God is revealed to the one that did not know God. So when you walk through the fire, when you walk in faith, in God, knowing that whatever the situation is, whatever the situation may bring, that if my life glorifies God, then God is going to be glorified and God is going to be with me, whatever the outcome may be. And so this king, Nebuchadnezzar, he was looking, and I can almost hear his voice when he asks the question after he sees the 4 men in the fire. He says, "Lo, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt." I'm sure he was astonished. He had already heated it up 7 times more. And you say, well, that couldn't possibly happen. I mean, this is just some story like Jonah, something you read that God puts in the Bible for entertainment. If you understand that God is sovereign, that God is all-powerful, that there's no other God besides Him, then there's nothing that He can't do. He can interrupt time. He can interrupt events. He can do anything that He chooses to do. You go back to the beginning in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If you can get past Genesis 1:1, you don't have any problem believing that story. But if you have a problem with Genesis 1:1, you probably are going to have a hard time believing this story. But I don't have any hard time believing this story, because I understand in the midst of this story that God is showing me something. He's showing me, one, that He honors faithfulness of His servants. Because you saw at the end of the story, the king promoted them. What did the servants of King Nebuchadnezzar want to do to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They wanted to rid the kingdom of these Jewish exiles. They were jealous of the positions that they held. They were jealous because they were intelligent. They had been given positions of authority. They stood out in the culture. They didn't blend in and fall down to the king at every whim. They stood out, and yet in the very end, because they honored God, God lifted them. What's the lesson for us today? That regardless of what we go through, that we need to honor God in all of our life, whatever the circumstances may be. Because God notices. We were created by God and for God. That's what Colossians, the first chapter, says. Colossians. I've been in Colossians. It's good. Steve, you still reading it? It's good. I mean, I've been there this week, and it's good. But you know, God is showing us His sovereignty, even over events that look like it would be the end. And so in the midst of this, you know, God can deliver us, you know, from a trial, but sometimes His will is to give us strength to endure the trial that comes into our life. I'm sure for those young men, you know, it wasn't easy. You know, it's one thing, you can stand up here in a pulpit and say, I believe in God. You let somebody walk through that door with a gun pointed at me and say you believe in God again, and I'm going to drop you where you're standing. It takes on a whole different perspective at that moment. But they didn't waver. You know, and the thing is that I heard one preacher say about this particular text. Notice that Jesus is comfortable in the fire. You know, that stood out to me. Because Jesus, He reveals Himself in the Old Testament just like He does in the New. We think that, you know, that Jesus isn't anywhere in the Old Testament. Well, you go back and you look at the different stories. You look at Moses and the burning bush. You look at Gideon hiding behind the winepress. You look at Jacob. You know, you look at Abraham when the three men came in Genesis 32 or 33, I forget what it is. But, you know, all of those are pictures of God in the Old Testament revealing Himself. And that's what He's doing here. He's revealing Himself to King Nebuchadnezzar that doesn't know Him. And Jesus is in the midst of that fire with these young men. You know, Jesus knew the pressure of life. Jesus knew the fires and trials that come along. You remember Jesus fasted 40 days and 40 nights before He went into the ministry. He was tempted of Satan. You remember what He endured headed to the cross, the physical beatings and the hurt and the pain, all that stuff. The hours upon the cross that He suffered, and He bled and He died. He was forsaken. He was left alone. He was mocked. He was ridiculed. He went through all of the things that so many of us endure in this life. And He went through so much more, but yet He was obedient to the Father. You know, these young men were obedient. And we can rest assured that if we remain obedient, God's going to be with us. Even when we're disobedient, God doesn't leave us nor forsake us. He's still there. Now, there may be consequences to our disobedience, but God's always there. And He was with these young men. When you move a little bit further, you know, you go back to looking at verse 25. And it says, these men were loose. You know, what are the things that bind us in life? There's a lot of things that bind people. One is fear. Tammy and I talk about it pretty regular. You know, I'm not a bold person by nature. And I have a hard time just, you know, somebody I don't know just walk up to and start talking and carrying on a conversation and sharing the gospel with them. It's hard for me. Now, I can talk to y'all. It doesn't bother me. I can talk to a big crowd in a church, and that don't bother me, but put me on the street, especially if you drop me out like downtown Atlanta or Savannah and said, all right, hit the street and go sharing the gospel. That's hard for me. But fear, you know, can paralyze you. You know, some people succumb to fear. Some people succumb to anxiety. Some people succumb to just a lack of trust in God. Well, God, I went through that and I didn't ever see you. I ain't never trusting you again. But we have to remember that, you know, so many of the things that bind us are the things that God wants to release us from. You know, these men were thrown into the fire bound by their clothes and by their hats and by their hose and all the other stuff. But when they got into fire, notice that they were loosed. They were walking around. I don't know what they were doing. I don't know if they were singing, praising God. I don't know what they were doing. But it caught the king's attention immediately. And if you're going through a trial, and if you're going through a difficult time, and you still maintain your faith, and you still acknowledge God as sovereign, people will take notice. You know, I can't relate to people that have gone down the path of cancer or leukemia or alcoholism or drugs or all of those. I can't relate to those people because I've never endured any of those things. But I can relate to people that have special needs children and people that have had, you know, emergency surgeries and on the brink of death and some of those things I can relate to. But, you know, in those moments, even when you go through those things, God gives you a platform. And if you'll just simply trust Him, don't mean that you got to have all the answers. I certainly don't have all the answers. I certainly have been through things and I go through it and I come out the other side and I'm still asking God, what was the purpose in that? But if you maintain your faith and you acknowledge God, I can guarantee you somebody takes notice. Somebody is watching and somebody is looking. This king immediately took notice. He knew he threw them in the fire bound and he knew they were loose. And a lot of people never live life because they wound up being bound their whole life. Because Satan tells that person, you're not worthy. That sin that you committed in your past, you're not worthy. That sickness that you're enduring right now, had you been obedient, you wouldn't be suffering. You're not worthy of God's healing. That alcohol, that drugs that you hit every afternoon, you just stay on that path. That's the only thing that you fit for. And we stay bound in those things. I want to flip over to Colossians, completely out of the context tonight, but flip over to Colossians just a minute. I got to go back there. And look over in chapter 1 just for a minute in Colossians, and then we'll jump back. And it says in Colossians 1, verse 15, in who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. Then jump down to verse 19. And it says, for it pleased the Father that in Him all fullness should dwell. Now I said that to say this. I said Sunday, I made the statement, if you don't see it before you see it, you'll never see it. And in that, if you don't see in the Old Testament the sovereignty of God and the working of God, if you don't see that, and you don't see the things in the world today lining up with God orchestrating the events of everything taking place in the world, then you'll never see and come to the peace and the provision of God. Because just like these men, you know, we're going to come to a place where we face death through, you know, unexpected events, through disease, through sickness, or just natural causes. One day we're coming to death. And the only way of deliverance from that moment is trust in Jesus Christ. Well, you look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were living on the other side of the cross. All they had was God's word. All they knew that God could be trusted. Now we live on the other side of the cross. We know that in Him all the fullness dwells. We know that the complete sovereignty of God hinges on Jesus Christ, His death, His burial, His resurrection. But we understand that He didn't begin in Bethlehem. That wasn't just when he began. He's always been from the beginning to the end. He's from everlasting to everlasting. He is the God in the Old Testament that is working his way through, and he's orchestrating all the events that are unfolding. But God has made a way through his Son, Jesus Christ, just like he made a way for these young men that were in the fire. They can be loosed because he is God, because he is sovereign, because he's all-powerful. We can be loosed today from the fear, from the anxiety, from the worry, from the sin, because of who Jesus is, God's Son. And you look through the rest of this story, and you see that Nebuchadnezzar, when we get down to verse 28, he says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own God." Now, when you go back earlier on in verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar had asked the question, who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Now he says in this verse, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." So all of a sudden he went from saying, who is this God that can deliver you out of my hand, to the blessing of God, because he realized that this God was not a normal God, that he was able to deliver them out of what they faced. So he now knows some things about God that he didn't know in the beginning. Some of those things that he knew is that he knew that this was the God, Yahweh, the God of Israel. He knew that this was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. And there's no doubt that he was full of power. There's no doubt that he could deliver his servants who trusted in him. He knew that this God was in the fire with them. Even though he had ordered their death, he gave them life, and he loosed them in the midst of the fire so that they could come out the other side and be promoted. He didn't know some things early on, but now he knows some things. He knows that this God of Shadrach, Meshach is a God that overruled the king's word, because he's God. Now, he didn't know him personally, but he now knows some things about God. Now, here's kind of where all this comes together. There's a lot of people today that know about God. You can come to church and you can hear sermons. You can listen to stories. You can be in the congregation and you can know a lot of things about God. But to personally know God, there's two elements to really have a personal relationship with God. One, you've got to trust God. You got to trust God that he's God and that he is God alone. And that he is sovereign over the affairs of everything taking place. And then you got to surrender your life to him. If you're going to have a personal relationship with God, it takes those two things. You got to have trust and you got to have surrender. So you can come to church all you want to, but if you're ever not at a place where you're willing to trust God or surrender your life to him, then you really don't have a personal relationship with God. These men had complete trust in God, and they completely surrendered to the will of God. And that's the same thing that God expects us to do today. To completely trust him regardless of the circumstances. Even when we go through stuff and we don't know what it means or we don't understand what God is doing. Well, God tells us in his word that we're not going to understand him in all things, because his ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts, because he's God alone. He used 3 young Jewish boys to get the attention of a king. God orchestrated that. But these young men trusted God and they surrendered their lives to him. Just knowing about God isn't enough to deliver you on the day of judgment, when God returns. Now, very quickly, the attitude of Nebuchadnezzar went from just inquiring about God and being full of himself to worshiping and honoring the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know, in our life is to be a full display of honoring God regardless of what the circumstances are. Now, I ask you very quickly, as I try and close it up. You know, we talked about Daniel. You know, where's Daniel in the midst of all this? Well, he's not here. We don't know where he's at. But he uses these 3 young boys to get the attention of the king. Well, Daniel's book is a lot of prophecy. And if you go over toward the book of Revelation, you're going to see that there's coming a day. And you can look specifically in Revelation 13 if you want to read that, about the Antichrist. And you see that the Antichrist that's going to come in the world during the period of tribulation, he's going to be just like Nebuchadnezzar, but he's going to be a whole lot worse. He's going to demand the people worship him. He's going to demand that the people fall down and worship him. Because the thing that Satan has always wanted was to be worshiped. And we have to understand the events that are coming in the latter days. Things are going to be more perilous. Things are going to get more chaotic. But if we're willing to trust God and surrender our lives to him and accept him as Lord of our life, just like these young boys accepted him, we don't have to fear the things that are coming. It says in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, "For God hath not appointed us unto wrath, but to obtain salvation by our God, Jesus Christ." Paul even said in 2 Thessalonians 1:7, he says, "Rest with us." In other words, take complete assurance in knowing that if you know God, if you trust God, surrender your life to God, then you don't have to be anxious. As you see all the kingdoms of the world passing, and you see all the world events unfolding, and you see all the perilous times and the chaos and the culture going down a road that you know is a terrible world, if you know God, you can stand firm in the midst of that world and just honor God, and whatever comes may come, because you know that even in the midst of the fire, whatever you may face, God is going to be with you. And we can honor God. Amen. It's out of time. So, thank the Lord. We'll pick up in Daniel 4 next week. Any questions, we can talk about them after church, but it's a little bit after 8. So let's stand together live.